Good afternoon and good evening, dear colleagues. If you're listening to this live, then you know that today is I think it's the 9th of January 2025, so Thursday evening, and I'm very pleased to introduce to you Professor Dr. Jana Lasser. Jana is a professor for data analysis at the ID lab of the University of Graz. She has a very impressive research track record with parts of it also in Germany. She will, in particular in Germany, she will come back to that certainly also during her own self-representation and presentation. The reason why she is here is that I had the privilege to meet her for the very first time a few weeks ago at a symposium at the University of Graz, and I was very, very impressed by her research work that is somehow similar to many of the things we try to deal with in our group. So somehow she's working on very, very similar topics, in particular platform regulations, hate speech, etc. But she's doing this with a very different set of tools and instruments than we are doing this. We look at this primarily with our legal eyes. She looks on this with a very interesting mixture, in my understanding, of technical and social sciences related or influenced instruments. And I was very, very deeply impressed by her presentation. And therefore, I invited her for this. And today, this has two purposes. The first one is to inform the general public, obviously. So everyone who is following this podcast is very kindly invited. And on the other hand, this is also directly relevant in my judgment for my law students. So there's also a target group today, which is the class on digital law in the law program of the University of Vienna. And I'm very excited. And that's all that I want to say as an introduction. Jana, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate that you invest so much time and effort into this. And the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, Nikolaus, for the kind introduction. As you already mentioned, I'm now a professor for data analysis at the University of Graz, kind of a computer scientist, but I started my research journey actually with a PhD in physics back in 2018 at the Max Planck Institute for Dynamics and Self-Organization in Göttingen, Germany. So I spent a good part of my research career so far in Germany. And I took this perspective of looking at things as systems, as complex systems with me. And then later on in my research career, I added all these toolkits of computer science, particularly machine learning and large-scale data analysis, and apply all of this to social science questions, particularly systems where humans interact with technology. And this is also how I came to the topic I'm going to talk about today. So today will be primarily about hate speech and counter speech on social media. And then in the second half of the presentation, I'll go a bit into further issues that online platforms tend to have, and also ideas on how we could actually make them a better place. This will be mostly a presentation, a talk, but I encourage you to ask any understanding questions that you might have while I'm talking. Nicholas will try to alert me if any questions come up, and I'll try to answer them right away. We will have a time for a discussion and an exchange of ideas in the end. And I really hope to have a lively discussion, because I'm actually very excited to talk to such an audience that is primarily people from the legal studies, because usually I tend to talk to other computer scientists or social scientists. So you're a very new crowd for me, and I'm very excited to talk to you. All right, let's jump right into it with a definition. What is it when I say hate speech? What am I talking about? Hate speech, we define as insults, discrimination, or intimidation, spreading fearful, negative, and harmful stereotypes, calling for exclusion or segregation, inciting hatred, and encouraging violence against individuals or groups. And now comes the second and very important part, on the grounds of their supposed race, ethnic origin, gender, religion, or political beliefs. And this definition of hate speech is also part of many laws on hate speech that make it illegal to spread such hate speech, and therefore also make it illegal to spread it in online environments. But as we know, it's very hard to kind of combat the spread of hate speech due to how fast everything is moving, how easy it is to stay anonymous, and so on. Why is hate speech a problem? Why do we care about it? Why do we want to reduce its prevalence? First of all, it's pretty widespread. Thankfully, there was a rather recent study from Austria where 3 in 10 people report that they have come across content online in the last 3 months that they consider hostile or degrading. Hate speech on a more societal level also threatens the discourse that happens online, because targets of online hate speech tend to leave social media or to strategically restrict the expression of their opinion, therefore impoverishing discourse that we can have online. And lastly, online hate also tends to turn into offline violence. There is a very well done, nice study from Germany that actually establishes a causal relationship between online hate comments and violent crimes against refugees. And they estimate that about 10% of violent crimes against refugees can be attributed to hate comments on Facebook. So with this, I hope I have convinced you that this is a problem that is worth caring about. And now I hope I can tell you what we can do about it. So what can we do against online hate speech? There are a few ideas around, many of which you will be familiar with. So we can, of course, start to delete hateful content or even block accounts that spread this content. This does work, but it can also be problematic because this borders censoring. And since not all hate is clearly hate, there's always judgment involved. And since we need to do this on a large scale and probably with automated systems, there's always a trade-off between freedom of expression and the reduction of hate speech. We could employ professional moderators on our platforms that make these decisions less arbitrary, because then there's human judgment involved. That's, of course, extremely expensive. We can then follow that up with criminal prosecution. I already mentioned that in many countries, spreading hate online is illegal. That is, of course, a tedious process and sometimes not really possible because people are anonymous. To deal with that, we could ask people to always authenticate themselves when they post something online with their real names to facilitate prosecution. That might sound like a nice idea when we think about countries like Austria, but if we think about dictatorships, this might become very dangerous very soon for dissidents that would like to express their opinion online, but would then be required to authenticate themselves. So another solution, the one that I'm going to talk to you about today mainly, is what we would call collective moderation. So what is collective moderation? Collective moderation is a bottom-up emergent reaction by the users of the platforms themselves that try to collectively do something against hate speech. So this is something that is not top-down enforced by the platforms, but an emergent reaction of the people that are on the platform together. So with this brief intro into the talk, I'll also show you a more formal outline. So in the next bit, I will introduce counter-speech a bit more formally as collective moderation. I will then show you a very interesting case study that we based our research on, the case of 2 online groups, Reconquista Germanica versus Reconquista Internet, that were battling each other on Twitter and gave us lots of data to study. I'll also give you a brief glance under the hood. So Nicolas already mentioned that we use very different tools. Coming from computer science, at this we use machine learning and we deal with lots of text data, and I'll try to give you a digestible idea for non-experts of how we do that. I'll then also answer what was our primary research question, namely what counter-speech strategy is most effective against online hate. And then after this kind of main research part of the talk, I'll go a bit further beyond hate speech into what we call more generally information disorders and information trustworthiness. So this relates less to hate speech and more to the case of misinformation and its spread online and how we could at least quantify that. And then I'll give you an outlook into a research project that started in January, so a week ago, in my lab, where we are thinking about how we could also approach the problem employing algorithmic moderation under the Digital Services Act. So with this, let me jump into counter-speech and how we can frame it as collective moderation. So what is counter-speech? Counter-speech tries to counter hate by presenting an alternative narrative of what is being talked about. It aims to, first of all, reduce the prevalence of hate, but also increase the overall quality of the discussions that happen online. And as I already mentioned, it's crucial that this is a bottom-up reaction by citizens, so it's not something that is done by professional moderators or even enforced top-down by the platforms themselves. Just to show you an example of what I'm talking about, counter-speech in the wild. Here we have an example of hate speech, first of all, that is spreading misinformation about a religion. It is a tweet. We have anonymized it by rephrasing it a bit, but the content or the meaning remained more or less the same. And the tweet reads, Muslims are derogatory against Jews and aggressive and violent. Their anti-Semitism is more pronounced as the Jews themselves. So this is an example of online hate speech that we found, and an example of counter speech that was posted below this hateful comment that tries to provide an alternative narrative by providing facts. And this tweet reads, according to the Ministry of the Interior under the CDU, 83% of anti-Semitic crimes were committed by right-wing extremists. Now, does this work? Trying to counter hate by just providing a different narrative? Research that is emerging around counter-speech shows that counter-speech can reduce the prevalence of hateful comments, especially if the counter-speakers themselves are organized. It can also improve the quality of online discussions, so the second goal of counter-speech online. And there is a small experiment that was conducted on mostly the Swiss Twitter sphere, that shows that especially empathy-based counter-speech strategies that apply to or try to use the empathy of the hate speaker to make them reconsider their hateful comment does reduce the prevalence of hate online. Now, I've already mentioned two strategies for counter-speech here. I've shown you an example where there was somebody providing a fact to counter hate speech. And here I told you that empathy-based counter-speech also reduces the prevalence of hate. And with this context, we asked ourselves the question, which counter-speech strategy is actually the most effective to reduce online hate? Before I go into answering this question, I want to draw your attention a bit to the ethical side of it, to also make an argument of how why we approached our question the way we did. So at the core, by asking which counter-speech strategy is most effective against hate, we are asking a causal question here. Traditionally, when we aim to answer a causal question, we require some experimentation. So we would like to intervene in the system and then see whether the intervention changes anything. And in the best case, we would do that via a randomized controlled trial. So we could have a group of online people, split them randomly into two groups, an intervention and then a control group. We could then apply a counter-speech strategy to one group and another counter-speech strategy to the other group, and then measure the outcome, namely the prevalence of tweets containing hate speech. However, there is a few problems with this approach. The first problem is an ethical one. To do this, we would actually need to expose real people to hate speech. And that's, well, we could do that if we can make a very good argument about the benefit of this research, but it's still a trade-off because, well, especially if we do this in a real online environment, we would also poison the online environment with even more hate. And the second problem is we would need to intervene in social media platforms at scale, and that is extremely hard to do because social media platforms, The companies that do not really like researchers to experiment on them. It's very, very hard, and we need to jump through many hoops to be able to pull off any experimentation on the platforms. And it's also getting increasingly difficult as the platforms shut down our possibilities to access data from them. So experimenting with online platforms was a bit out of the question for us. What did we do instead? We used what we call digital traces. So when people use online platforms, they leave what we call these digital traces. They leave comments, they leave posts, they leave reactions to posts. All of them have nice timestamps. We can collect them, we can analyze them. And the nice thing about these digital traces is that they allow us to directly observe behavior in the wild. So this is not an experimental environment where we invite people to the lab or we ask them to imagine some artificial situation and then describe their reaction. This is really observing people, how they behave in the wild, and therefore the ecological validity of what we do here is very, very high because we observe the real thing directly. However, these digital traces are, of course, not created with research as their primary purpose. They are created because people like to post and react to things in online environments. So we kind of need to make do with the data we get from that and jump through a few hoops to make that data usable to answer our research questions. And of course, digital traces are not representative of the general population. They are, however, representative of the people using the specific digital platform that we study. So I would make an argument that if we want to study the effectiveness of counter speech against hate on Twitter, if we use digital traces from Twitter, we have a very, very good representativeness of the population that we study. All right, that being said, let's go to our case study. So we needed a case study where we could collect these digital traces to study the dynamics of hate versus counter speech, and then also identify different counter speech strategies and figure out which of them was most effective. And we found a very nice one from Germany. And this was the case of two organized groups that were active on Twitter and were kind of fighting each other. The first one, they call themselves Reconquista Germanica. They are a right-wing extremist group. They were founded before the German federal elections in 2017. Some scholars call them kind of an online arm of the German AfD. That's a bit disputed. What we know is that they had about 5,000 members. And what they did was that they were attacking the Twitter accounts of prominent German newspapers, so news outlets like Der Spiegel, Die Zeit, or Tagesschau, and also prominent journalists by posting hateful comments below content of these Twitter accounts. And then there was a second group. They called themselves Reconquista Internet. They were founded or their foundation was instigated by comedian Jan Böhmermann, that kind of encouraged the formation of such a civil rights movement to counter hate online. They were founded a bit later in April 2018, also had on the order of 4,000 to 5,000 members, and their motto was that they would aim to act for love and reason on the internet and the civilization of social discourse on social networks. So what did these two groups do? So I already mentioned Reconquista Germanica targeted these accounts of online news outlets, specifically 22 of these accounts that we looked at for our case study. Whenever Reconquista Germanica would show up and post hate, Reconquista Internet would get to know about that and would try to post counter speech below the hate. And this interaction resulted in a total of about 180,000 conversations. And these conversations included about 1.3 million tweets. Overall, our data set spans a time period from January 2015 to December 2018. Why do we already start in 2015? Well, we know which accounts belong to Reconquista Germanica and Reconquista Internet. So we could trace back the activity of these accounts to January 15 and collect all the conversations that these accounts produced, even before the groups were formally founded and started calling themselves Reconquista Germanica and Reconquista Internet. And as I already said, this is nice because this is user behavior in the wild. This really happened on Twitter, and we were able to collect the conversations. Now, how does such a conversation look like? Each conversation is started by a post from a news outlet or journalist. Then Reconquista Germanica would come in and post something hateful. Shortly after, Reconquista Internet would come and try to post counter speech. And then the rest of the conversation tree unfolds. And we are interested in this rest of the conversation tree. So what does happen in the rest of the conversation tree, depending on which counter speech intervention was posted by Reconquista Internet early in the conversation tree. And we are particularly interested in the prevalence of toxicity and hate. So I will get into this in detail a bit later. Toxicity is kind of another facet of, we call it uncivil discourse online. So we also wanted to quantify that. And we are also interested in the number of neutral users, so users that belong to neither Reconquista Germanica nor Reconquista Internet, that kind of stay involved in the conversation, because we consider that a signal of the quality of the conversation. So if the counter speech manages to keep the conversation civil enough that neutral users do not leave it, we also consider that a sign of success of the counter speech. And then, of course, we can differentiate between different counter speech strategies that were used and can figure out which had the best effect on these outcome measures that we consider. Which counter speech strategies did we consider? There we first did a literature review of the work that already existed on counter speech. It's a small research field, but it's growing. And we also did a deep reading of 1,000 randomly selected tweets from our dataset to see which counter speech strategies are actually used in the wild in our dataset. And we identified a number of different counter speech strategies. We identified some that we summarized as constructive comments, so providing information, asking questions, pointing out consequences, pointing out contradictions, and also simply calling out hate. And I give you an example of providing information here. We already had that. We also found another very prevalent strategy, which is simply providing an opinion. So giving an honest opinion, importantly without being insulting, but that does not have to be objective and it does not have to be justified. An example of that would be a user that posts, "Heiko Maas, stay strong." That was a politician in Germany at the time. Politicians acting on their beliefs and not based on coalition agreements are very likable to me. So that's an opinion. Doesn't have any facts, but it's also not insulting. We also identified a fair bit of sarcasm that was being used against hate speech. And with sarcasm, we use that as an umbrella term for sarcasm, irony, and cynicism, but importantly, again, not insulting. And an example for that is a post that reads, "Oh no, a politician communicating with the people without involving the media, how dare he?" We also found that members of Reconquista Internet would use insults as counter-speech strategy, so they would insult back. And we differentiated between a few kinds of insult, directly insulting a person or an institution, an insult based on gender, religion, or ethnicity. That could actually also be hate speech if it qualifies, and an insult based on political orientation. So an example of that would be members of Reconquista Germanica are just disgusting brown vermin. That is directly insulting the members of this group. Now you might notice that I did not mention empathy as a strategy. We initially wanted to consider empathy as a strategy, but we simply didn't find it. So in our dataset, we found a low single-digit number of empathic counter-speech comments. which was simply too little to do anything quantitative with it. So this is why we did not consider empathy as a distinct strategy, and we subsumed the instances of empathy that we found under this constructive comment category. So now that we have categories of different counter-speech strategies, we need to go technical, because what we have is we have 1.3 million tweets, and we can, of course, not read all of these tweets ourselves to label them with different counter-speech strategies. So we want some automatic means to detect different counter-speech strategies. And we also want some automated means to actually measure the prevalence of hate, of toxicity, and also of what we call extremity of the users. Because remember, we are also interested in how many neutral users stay involved in the conversation. And to this end, we use machine learning. So what we do, very briefly summarized, is we fine-tune a machine learning model for sequence prediction. These models are called transformers. That is why I show you a toy transformer here. And we fine-tune it, so we train it by using a small number of examples of these counter-speech strategies. And then after being trained, it can identify similar posts with a certain probability. And because I'm a computer scientist, after all, I still want to give you a small look under the hood. So how does this actually work? How does such a transformer model do its magic? That has two parts. The first part is what we call pre-training. So with this pre-training, we take a machine learning model and we teach it how to speak a language, basically. And how that is done is that there is a large corpus, so a large collection of documents, millions and billions of them. You can imagine somebody has collected basically all of the internet to compile this corpus. And then the model is trained to predict words in a sequence. And it is trained by basically having to fill in blanks in texts. So given an original document, individual words are blanked out, and the model is then asked to fill in these gaps again. And if it fills in the right word, it is rewarded. And if it fills in the wrong word, like the red ones here, it is penalized. And by doing this again and again and again over billions of documents, the model learns very well to predict the next word in a sequence of words. So after this pre-training, we have a model that can speak a language pretty well, or can actually generate the next word in a sequence. But that is not all, because that doesn't help us to detect counter-speech strategies yet. So we need a second step. Oh, and by the way, these so-called pre-trained models, they are widely available, free, online. There is a place called the Hugging Face Model Hub where these models are posted. There are different flavors of them. We actually used a multilingual one that doesn't speak only English, that speaks many languages, because we had predominantly German texts. And we used one that was actually explicitly pre-trained on social media texts, that makes it a bit more able to deal with text that might not be grammatically very correct, that also includes emojis, and that is just very short. So we grabbed such a pre-trained model from the internet, and then we did what is called fine-tuning. So basically what we do here is we only retrain a small part of the model, namely what is called the last layer, such that it does not predict the next word, but instead of predicting the next word, it tells us, given a text, what type of text is this? And to train or to fine-tune the model in this way, what we need is a small, and when I say small, I mean a few thousand examples, so a small data set of documents and what is called labels. So we would have a document and a label that says this is a constructive comment, or a document and a label that says this is an insult. And this we can feed into our model, train it a bit further. And after this fine-tuning, the model is then able to, given an unknown text, provide us with a prediction of the probability that this text contains a certain counter-speech strategy. So we would give the model an unknown document, and the model would tell us, this document, I'm 90% certain, is a constructive comment. And this is exactly what we need, because once we have trained this model, we can run our 1.3 million documents through it, and it will spit out the different counter-speed strategies as labels that we're interested in. Where does this small data set that we use for fine-tuning come from? Well, it is made by humans. Some poor person, or many of them, need to sit down and read tweets and provide us with labels for different counter-speech strategies. So we did that. We employed research assistants to label 10,000 tweets with all these different counter-speech strategies that I mentioned before. And what we see by staring at this is that some of them are pretty prevalent, opinion, for example, and some of them are extremely rare. And this is a problem for machine learning, because if we only have very few examples of something, then our model fails to learn to identify the strategy. So while initially we would have liked to differentiate all these different fine-grained counter-speech strategies, the fact that some of them were so rare made us condense them into these 4 umbrella strategies. So we ended up with opinion as its own strategy, sarcasm as its own strategy, then constructive comments that subsumes providing information, asking questions, pointing out consequences, pointing out inconsistencies, and then what we call leaving factual discussion, which is all the insult categories. And then there's, of course, a fair number of tweets that we simply could not label as any counter-speech strategy, that were either unintelligible or something else. And then there was also a few foreign language tweets that we excluded altogether because it was easier to simply deal with only German language data. So this is how it looked in the end. This is the overall prevalence of these strategies in our data set. And you can see there is actually quite a bit of imbalance. Opinion and other are the most frequent things we find. Sarcasm is the least frequent, and constructive comments and insults are about the same with 15%. Now, that all sounds very nice, but I want to draw your attention to a bit of a caveat or a limitation of this approach, namely that even humans often disagree on the content or the label of such a post. Take this example, a tweet that reads, "With donated laptops full with learning software by LabDo, one could achieve a lot." What is this? Is this an opinion? Is it a fact, like providing information, therefore a constructive comment? Our annotators disagreed. The first one said this is a constructive comment. The second one said it's an opinion. And that happens fairly frequently. And it tends to happen even more if the annotators have very different perspectives and a different view on the world. So in general, the annotations that we get from our human annotators will reproduce the biases of these annotators. We used 3 psychology master students. They were all white, female, and very well educated, and likely pretty left. But they were also all very politically informed, and we spent a lot of time training them, discussing the different categories with them, and also training them to not let their own political orientation or convictions influence their labeling, but rather stick to the written definitions of what the different categories are when they provided the labeling. There's a whole research field that branches off this observation of human biases that are reflected in annotation data for machine learning models, which is the field of data perspectivism, that takes this to a whole new level and tries to incorporate different human perspectives into machine learning models. My talk is not going to be about that, but that is an extremely important research direction and development when we talk about using machine learning models, especially when it comes to things like automated moderation online. because we have to recognize that there are different perspectives and they get condensed into computational models if we use humans to train these models. All right, I'll leave this tangent and return to our study. So we are now in a good position to answer our central research question, namely, which of the 4 counter-speech strategies, constructive comments, sarcasm, insults, actually help best against online hate? I already touched on this briefly. So we have 3 indicators of effectiveness that we actually look at. The first one is a reduction of hate. So to measure the reduction of hate, we classify tweets as hateful, again, using a custom machine learning model that measures the probability of a tweet to be hateful and then simply measure the prevalence of hate. We do the same for toxicity. So how do we define toxicity? A toxic comment is a rude, disrespectful, or inappropriate comment that could cause somebody to leave a discussion. That is different from hate, and it's also usually not illegal, but we are still interested in also looking at toxicity. Why? Because toxicity also tends to impoverish conversations by making people leave them. Plus, there is a very widely used toxicity classifier that is provided by Google Jigsaw that measures toxicity in posts. And we really wanted to use that to compare to our own hate speech classification, kind of as a sanity check, and also because this is used very widely in online moderation already. And then third indicator is a reduction of political extremity. So here, what we do is we again use a machine learning model that measures how similar a user is to members of a Reconquista Internet or Reconquista Germanica. So in this context, we consider members of both groups to be kind of politically extreme. And since we're interested in how many people that are not members of these groups are staying in the discussion, we use this to measure what we call political extremity and then count how many not politically extreme users stay in the conversation after a counter-speech intervention. Then we need to do a little bit of statistics to actually get to the numbers. And we do this on different levels of the conversations. So the first and probably also most intuitive level that we do is we do a micro-scale analysis of post-reply pairs. So what we do here is we identify sequences of posts where a user posts hate, a counter-speech intervention comes in, and the same user that originally posted the hate then replies to the counter-speech intervention. And we use sequences of such posts that are as similar as possible to each other with respect to all other variables, like the time when it happened, the number of followers that the users have, their emotions that they express in their tweets, and so on, except for the counter-speech strategy that we identify. Because then we can be fairly certain that any change we observe in the last post, so the reply, is caused by the difference in counter-speech strategies and not some other spurious thing that also went on in the conversation. And then we measure the difference in hate and the difference in toxicity between these replies in the matched sequences. The second level, and I apologize for the math, it's the only slide with math here. I'm going to explain what it does. You don't need to understand the equation. So the second level of analysis that we did is what we call a mesoscale analysis. So here we are interested not in what happens in specific tweet reply sequences, but we're interested in what happens in all of the conversation tree. So basically, we model the conversation tree as a time-resolved sequence of posts that, and for every post in the sequence, we consider not only its own content, but also the content of the preceding posts. That is a so-called auto-regressive distributed lag model for the experts. And there we can then figure out how much a change in counter speech strategy in the beginning of the reply tree changes the dynamics in the rest of the reply tree. And since we have so many conversations that we can model this way, the nice thing is that we can fit such a model for many conversations. There are 3,600 that are long enough to do this. And then we can do a meta-analysis of the coefficients of these fitted models, which is very nice because this gives us very robust estimates of the effects, because we do this 3,600 times, and any effect that persists in all of these different conversations is likely very robust to any random fluctuations that go on otherwise. And the third level that we also look at is we do a statistical analysis on what we call the macro scale. So here we are interested in not only what happens in the single reply tree, but what happens over the course of a day or a week or a month in the whole Twitter discourse. And we do the very same thing that we did with the conversation trees, modeling sequences of events using such a autoregressive distributed lag model. But this time we model not only individual posts, we model aggregates over days and weeks of the conversation. And we're interested in how does a higher prevalence of a given counter-speech strategy on a given day influence the discourse on the next day, the next week, the next month, and so on. And so from these three different levels of analysis, we get many different results. Some of them appear only on one level. Some of them have different directions on different levels. And what I will show you in the following are the results that are robust, meaning significant on all levels, and go into the same direction on all levels. So this is the big summary slide answering the core research question: what helps against hate, toxicity, and extremity online? Well, constructive comments, interestingly, do robustly help against toxicity. So they reduce the prevalence of toxic comments, but they increase the prevalence of extremism. And this at first surprised us, but then thinking about it again, it also kind of makes sense, because if somebody comes at you with a smart-ass constructive comment, you might feel inclined of doubling down on your opinion and potentially even getting more extreme in defending it. So we think that this observation that constructive comments tend to backfire when it comes to extremity is an indication of this dynamic that I just described. Sarcasm, on the other hand, reduces extremity, and on some of the analysis levels also robustly helps against the prevalence of toxicity and hate, and it doesn't make anything worse. Giving an opinion always helps against extremity, against toxicity, and also against hate. And nice sanity check, insulting makes everything worse. And this, I think, is a very hopeful message for people that are actually on the ground trying to do counter speech, because simply providing an opinion seems to be the best strategy. It unanimously makes everything better and nothing worse. And that's also the easiest thing to do, right? You don't need to research anything. You don't need to craft a sophisticated argument. It's sufficient to be there and give an opinion that is not insulting. That's the only requirement. So to also kind of contextualize these results a little bit, by this analysis approach that we employ, for every single post, we only get a probability that it contains a certain strategy. So we are not completely certain. It's just a probability. That means that for any given strategy, we can also only say that it's more effective against hate, toxicity, or extremity on average. We cannot say with certainty that a specific post will always be successful against reducing hate, toxicity, or extremity. Everything I say here are statements that are true on the aggregate, but not necessarily for individual interactions. So to summarize this part of the talk and also the longer part of the talk, I hope I have convinced you or shown you that counter-speech is an effective self-organized strategy of citizens to counter hate. So to give you the raw numbers, it's actually able to reduce the prevalence of hate and toxicity and extremity on the order of 10 to 20%, depending on the level of analysis, but that's about the magnitude that we observe. And it's an alternative to these top-down measures, like censoring, moderation, or requiring people to authenticate. I hope I've also shown you that this approach of using digital trace data and machine learning is really helpful to understand such a complex societal phenomenon that would be really hard to study experimentally if it wasn't for this digital trace data. And to restate what I think is the main finding, stating a simple opinion, potentially with a touch of humor, is the most effective strategy against hate, toxicity, and extremity that we found. So with that, a brief look to the comments. I think there are no questions so far.
No, Jana, at the moment there are so far no questions here. It's just everyone listening and me also listening. So I don't know whether you want me to ask questions now or whether you would prefer to continue. Up to you.
So if there's any understanding questions, that would be a good point. Otherwise, I'm happy to simply go on and then have a broader discussion in the end. All right.
So it looks as if everything was clear. For me, everything was clear and there are no questions yet. So I would suggest, therefore, to continue.
Then let's do that. Yeah. Okay. So I call this next part Beyond Hate Speech, Information Disorders and Trustworthiness. So what I just talked about, hate speech online, is one specific problem that we see in online environments, but it's by far not the only problematic thing that happens. Especially the prevalence of what we vaguely call misinformation is something that is heavily discussed these days, implicated in many developments that we find dangerous or threatening. And it's also something that I've spent a fair bit of time researching. And that's why I also want to dive a little bit into this to kind of lay the groundwork of the outlook that I'm going to provide in the end. What is misinformation actually? Misinformation is an extremely broad term that different people use very differently, and it encompasses a great many things. And when we start thinking a bit more systematically about what misinformation actually is, we usually arrive at a kind of two-dimensional picture of characteristics that a piece of information can have that can be more or less problematic. So we can kind of characterize a piece of information based on how factual it is. So is it consistent with what we could observe in the real world? That would be a high facticity. Or is it not consistent? That would be low. And how deceptive it is. So is it trying to deceive the reader? Because even a true piece of information, a factual piece of information, can still be deceptive, for example, by leaving out important context or by leaving out an important part of the information. And it is kind of two-dimensional spectrum of characteristics. We can try to slot in different types of pieces of information that we can observe in conversations. So there is, of course, what the research community calls misinformation, and that we define usually as false or misleading content, but importantly, shared without malicious intent. So if my grandma forwards me a shady article about a natural remedy that claims to do something, she very likely does not do that with malicious intent, even though the content she shares with me could be complete bogus. There is also what we call disinformation. This is false or fabricated content shared with the explicit intent to mislead or cause harm. And the tricky thing here is that misinformation and disinformation can be exactly the same content. The only thing that is different is the intent that with which it is being shared. And intent is something that is notoriously hard to measure because we cannot read people's minds, of course. Then there's also false or fake news that is in principle very similar to disinformation. So it's content that's verifiably false. These days, this also includes deepfakes or what we call cheapfakes, so that would just be photoshopping. The only difference to disinformation, it's kind of more of a further qualification, is that it explicitly tries to imitate news-like content. So it tries to imitate content that newspapers would put out. Then there are systematic lies. They also overlap with the disinformation and fake news categories. Here, the kind of additional gist is that these are carefully constructed fabrications or obfuscations, and they can also come from states or institutions. Classic examples here is the narrative of the weapons of mass destruction that were supposedly found in Iraq and were used as a kind of justification for the invasion, and only later turned out to be a systematic lie. There is what we call malinformation. This is not different on the facticity spectrum. This is true information, but it is shared with the intent to cause harm. And this could be hate speech, but it could also be private information. Think revenge porn. This is true information. It might be a video of something that really happened, but it's something that is explicitly shared with the intention of cause harm to somebody. There's also propaganda that kind of has very similar characteristics. That is information that could very well be true, but it's shared in a way that is biased, so it leaves out important contexts or important parts of the information, or in a misleading way, and it is explicitly used to promote a political cause or point of view. There is satire and parody. This is stuff that is obviously bogus, but it is also not shared with the intent to mislead. It is usually shared with the intent to amuse, and it also doesn't try to hide that it is false. Every now and a while, and then some politician doesn't get it and shares a piece of the Tagespresse or Titanic as if it was true, but usually that is not a problem, and people recognize when something is satire or parody. And then there are conspiracy theories, which kind of tend to hover on the very low end of the facticity spectrum and on the rather high end of the deceptiveness spectrum. And they try to provide alternative explanations for traditional news, events that happen in the world, but with the gist that they assume that everything that happens is controlled by a secret elite group and is trying to harm the normal citizen. And when we talk about information disorders, we usually talk about the things that are contained in this gray circle. So disinformation, false or fake news, systematic lies, conspiracy theories, and misinformation. And we're not concerned with malinformation or propaganda, and we're also not concerned with satire and parody. And the kind of story goes, or the hypothesis is, that disinformation disorders have become more prevalent in online environments, and they also threaten democratic processes and civic discourse. And while the research is still ongoing and there is a lot of activity that really tries to link or establish the causal relationship between the spread of such information and threats to democratic processes and civic discourse, the evidence that is emerging is accumulating in a way that I think by now it's pretty safe to say that yes, online environments and the spread of such content is very, very likely to contribute to erosion of democratic processes, democratic backsliding, and impoverishment of civic discourse. That's of course bad. We would like to do something about it. And similar to what I showed you before, to be able to do something about it, we usually first need to measure it and establish that it's there. And there are a few ways to try to do that. So to identify such a disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy-related piece of content, we could go ahead and assess the quality of an individual post or article that this is being shared. That would be the so-called content-based approach. Or a second approach, we could go ahead and assess the quality of the source that shared the piece of content. And here we are specifically interested in assessing the quality of what we call news-like content. The first approach, so assessing the quality of individual articles, is very, very time-consuming and is also practically relatively difficult because oftentimes it's not possible to establish the facticity, let alone the intent of something at the time it is being shared by assessing the content, because then somebody would need to sit down and arbitrate between this is true, this is false. Sometimes that's simply not possible. Sometimes it's ambiguous at the point. Sometimes we know only later what was true and what is false. So the second approach, trying to assess the process that was followed to arrive at a piece of information, that is something that is much more tractable. First of all, because assessing sources means we need to assess far fewer things. There is only so many news outlets as compared to millions and billions of news articles that are shared every day. And we can also follow established journalistic criteria in assessing the quality of a news outlet. That gives us kind of a grounding in established practices and makes the whole process less arbitrary. And thankfully, that is already being done as we speak. There's even a company that specializes on doing this. They're called NewsGuard, and they assess journalistic practices of news outlets on a point scale. They provide 100 points in total, where 100 points is the best score and 0 points is the lowest score, meaning a very untrustworthy source. And as I said, they do this by assessing individual journalistic quality criteria that news outlets follow that relate to these two dimensions of information trustworthiness that I introduced before, facticity and deceptiveness. So they assess whether a news outlet repeatedly publishes false content, whether they gather and present information responsibly, and whether they have processes to identify and correct errors. And in the deceptiveness dimension, they assess whether they handle the difference between news and opinion responsibly, whether they avoid deceptive headlines, disclose ownership and financing, clearly label advertising, reveal who is in charge, and also provide the names and bios of content creators. And this assessment of news outlets by NewsGuard we can use to assess the quality of information that circulates online at scale, especially for countries where NewsGuard has established a pretty comprehensive coverage of the whole news ecosphere. That is the US, UK, Germany, increasingly also France and Italy, and they're branching out to Austria, New Zealand, and Australia, and adding more countries as we speak. So we did that in some of our studies. We didn't use NewsGuard, In the beginning, we didn't trust it so much, so we spent a fair bit of time assessing how good it actually is. We did a manual assessment of the coverage. So we looked at content that is being shared online, and we checked how much of it is actually indexed by NewsGuard and how much is not. And by looking at what was not indexed by NewsGuard, we found that they're actually not missing any major news sources. So that was quite convincing to us. And the few news sources, so on the order of 3 to 5, depending on the country, that they missed were also not biased. So there were a few on the left spectrum of the political continuum and a few on the right. So we didn't identify any systematic biases. And second, we also established that this rating of journalistic quality that is provided by NewsGuard is in good agreement with other similar ratings that are used in the academic world to assess news quality. The kind of main players here are Media Bias Fact Check and Afontas Media, and they have extremely high correlations with the assessment by NewsGuard. If binary is a kind of fringe one that is very small and also uses a different classification scheme. Here the correlation is a bit lower, but that convinced us that there is pretty high agreement between different fact-checking organizations that assess news quality, and it's fairly reliable to use these ratings. And then the nice thing is that this also gives us additional context. So NewsGuard not only rates thousands of news outlets, they also classify them into the left side and the right side of the political spectrum, and they classify the scope of the news outlets. So they say whether it's health news, political news, regional news, celebrity news, whatnot. So we could also use that to kind of look into different aspects of the conversations depending on the news outlet. So this is how large parts of the misinformation research landscape currently assesses trustworthiness of information by using NewsGuard or similar lists to NewsGuard. And just to give you a flavor of what we do with this, this is from a study that we published now almost 3 years ago. We scraped all the tweets of politicians in the US and Germany and also the UK, but I only show you the US and Germany here. And then we measured the trustworthiness of the information they shared using NewsGuard. And what I show you here is simply the average NewsGuard score of stuff posted by these politicians, stratified by party over time. So what you can see here is that Democrats in the US are extremely consistent in sharing very high quality news, whereas Republicans were always a bit worse and have been deteriorating quite a bit in the recent years, which is something that was rather consistent with our expectations, let's say. Interestingly, in Germany, we don't see that trend. So we see that right-wing parties, especially the AfD, are consistently worse, but they are not getting worse. So they stay on the same, a bit lower level. So why have I shown you this? Being able to quantify the trustworthiness of a piece of information that is being shared online is one crucial puzzle piece to kind of assess the discourse that is happening in online spaces and potentially even steer is a strong word, but kind of influence moderation decisions. And this kind of zoom into misinformation is a stepping stone to what I want to cover in the very last part of my presentation, which is an outlook into work that we just started in my lab, which is about what we call algorithmic moderation. And also, and here comes the very close connection to the law community, the Digital Services Act that is now in force in the EU. So far, I have introduced different ways of moderating online discourses. I've talked a lot about collective moderation, counter speech, deleting content, prosecuting people. These are all means to reduce bad stuff online, where bad stuff can be hate speech, can be information disorders more generally. Why do we want to do this? So why do we want to reduce the bad stuff online? Of course, maybe because it's illegal, but then also because we think that what people see determines to some extent what they do. So all this evidence that is mounting that online environments lead to democratic backsliding, to deterioration of trust, to polarization, this all relates to the central hypothesis that the content that people consume online makes them behave in a certain way that is bad, and we want to do something about that. Now, what controls what people see online? The content that is shown to people on social media platforms is controlled by content recommendation algorithms. Therefore, content recommendation algorithms might be a good place to intervene if we want to change how online environments function. So the question that I want to answer going forward is whether algorithmic moderation, so changing the content recommendation algorithms, might be able to improve the situation, namely the bad interaction we see between online environments and societal outcomes. Why do we need content recommendation systems in the first place? Here I'll give you a very, very brief rundown of how content recommendation online works. So on a given platform like X or Facebook or Instagram, hundreds of millions of posts are created every day, and nobody can read all of this content. So we need a relatively powerful system to condense these hundreds of millions of posts into something that is digestible for individuals. The very first layer of this is a moderation layer that usually works in a rule-based way and that deletes illegal content. This is intellectual property filters on YouTube that remove the videos that have IP rights on them. This is child sexual abuse material filters that usually operate as blacklists of content pieces that are automatically recognized and then deleted. But that still leaves hundreds of millions of posts. So after this moderation layer, we need something that selects content to be shown to individual users. And that is usually only a few hundred pieces of content per user and session. And this is done, so this content is selected, and then usually it's also ranked into a feed where something is shown first and then something comes after, and so on and so on. And this selection and then ranking of content, which we could also conceptualize as kind of a distribution of attention of the users through the platform, this is currently done predominantly using what is called predicted engagement. So what the platform does is the content recommendation systems, it analyzes user behavior. It analyzes what a user tends to interact with, tends to comment on, tends to like, tends to share, and then trains massive machine learning models that for a given piece of content predicts how likely a user is to interact with a piece of content. And then the content recommendation system selects the pieces of content that are most likely to elicit engagement by a user. Why is it done this way? Because of the business model of the platforms. Platforms like users to stay on them for a long time and to come back. Why? Because if users see a lot of content, they also see a lot of ads, and that's the business model of the platforms. The problematic part of this is that we tend to engage with content that is outrageous and that is tends to be emotional or that tends to be controversial. So these content recommendation systems funnel attention of users towards content that is elicits very strong emotion and might be more outrageous than other content that is less engaging. And as I've already hinted at, on the societal level, we see evidence emerging that this facilitates the spreading of extreme viewpoints. This also contributes to declining social trust and polarization in societies, and this also tends to erode political knowledge, especially if users expect to be presented with relevant information by default and stop looking for information on their own. Now, looking at this, we might have the idea that changing the algorithms might be a good way forward. And this is also what I'm convinced is a good way forward and what I would like to do in the future. There's very, very few studies that tried to do this so far, mainly because it's extremely hard to do this on platforms, as I already said, because they're not interested in allowing such studies on alternative content recommendation algorithms. Most famously, there's the Facebook and Instagram election studies that were conducted in 2020 and published 1.5 years ago, where they tried to change the content recommendation system on Facebook and Instagram for a selected group of users in the US by switching from the standard recommendation algorithm to a chronological algorithm. And that shows no decrease in their primary outcome, namely polarization. However, that study was heavily criticized recently because it turns out that Facebook behind the scenes also changed their default algorithm at the same time. So the study doesn't actually show a comparison between an alternative algorithm and the default Facebook algorithm. It only shows a comparison between the alternative algorithm and something else that Facebook did at the same time, which is not what they usually do to recommend content, which is very problematic for the study design. And there is some emerging evidence from experimental studies in controlled environments that show that so-called bridging-based or intelligence-based ranking that tries to bridge ideological divides by showing people from different groups content that the respective other group also likes, is actually able to increase belief accuracy and consensus formation. But these are very, very small studies with relatively low ecological validity. But what we consistently see in all of the studies is that if these algorithms do not solely optimize for engagement anymore, then user engagement is usually reduced. It's kind of intuitive, but it's also a problem because that threatens the bottom line of these companies, right? So they have zero intrinsic interest of changing their content recommendation algorithms, which they have fine-tuned so carefully to produce the maximum engagement. So this brings us to the regulators, because here we have a clear case where the interests of the companies are not aligned with the interests of society at large anymore. And this can usually be resolved by regulators stepping in and trying to balance the interests of companies versus the interests of societies. And in the EU, this is done by the Digital Services Act, which you're probably way more familiar with than I am. I'm only familiar with 2 of its articles, 33 and 34. Article 34 says that providers shall diligently identify any actual or foreseeable negative effects on civic discourse and electoral processes and public security. And Article 34 says that they shall then put in place mitigation measures tailored to the specific systemic risks. Such measures may include adapting the algorithmic systems, including the recommender systems. So what that means is, at least to me, the regulator has recognized that these platforms do pose a risk to things that we hold dearly in society, such as electoral processes and civic discourse and public security. And they have identified adapting recommender systems as a means to reducing these risks. This is nice. This establishes that we do care about these things and we do want to reduce these risks. But there is still a very, very long way from these very abstract risks to concrete interventions in content recommendation. Because we would need to determine, in the end, if a single tweet poses a risk to civic discourse, for example, and it should therefore be ranked lower or not shown at all. And there is a lot of technical difficulties involved in making this determination. And this is where I hope my research can contribute something. I want to specifically focus on civic discourse as one of these risks. Why? Because civic discourse is likely at the heart of what democratic societies need to function. And there's also a lot of social science theory and thinking being done about what good civic discourse might look like that I can build on. And some ideas that we've had is that improving civic discourse might involve, for example, increasing the attention that we give trustworthy information, that we give diverse information, that we give informative content, while decreasing the visibility of incivility, so hateful or toxic content, polarizing content, or also decreasing the segregation in who sees which piece of content. And two of these things I've covered today. So I've covered incivility in the form of hate speech and toxicity, and I've covered trustworthiness. And I hope I have given you an idea on how these things could be quantified, measured, and then following that also treated differently in content recommendation systems. And the other things, they are also quantifiable. We just need machine learning that operates at scale and enough data to train that. This research is funded by the European Union already. I'm in the process of hiring people to do it, and I really hope that we can contribute to what the regulator in the EU is trying to do with platforms. And specifically, what we aim to do in the next 4 years is that we really want to go at this from a place that is grounded in social science and communication theory. So we want to involve, first of all, the theoretical background of what good civic discourse has been conceptualized to be, but then also integrate people's judgments in what they perceive good civic discourse is supposed to look like online into the development of concrete algorithms. While doing this, we are aware that any intervention in a content recommendation algorithm might infringe on somebody's freedom of expression. And these infringements on freedom of expression need to be balanced with the reduction of the risk to civic discourse. And this balance is a delicate one that might also depend on the temporal and regional context. So we might prefer a different balance in a case where we have a pandemic going on or shortly before an election versus a situation where nothing specific is going on. We might be more lenient in this balance. But this needs to be explicit. It's probably also a choice that needs to be explicitly made by the regulator. And then a crucial kind of step to round this off is that we want to test these alternative algorithms before we let them out into the world. And to do this, we want to develop what we call digital twins of online platforms. So we basically want to create a clone of X and a clone of Reddit that behaves exactly like the real thing, but with simulated people, and then try out different content recommendation algorithms on these digital twins. Why? Because it's that hard to experiment on the real platforms, and it allows us to try many, many different things without expending so many resources, and we can sidestep all these ethical considerations of experimenting with real people at such a large scale. And then, of course, hopefully in the very end, we can condense all of this into concrete recommendations for platform regulations under the DSA. I think this is a very, very good opportunity now that the DSA is in force, and it opens the window for the first time to actually do something about content recommendation in online platforms. But it's also still a very long way from the law to concrete interventions in platforms. I'll briefly brush over this. So studying algorithms with digital twins, I think, is a good idea because it seems very doable. These online environments are extremely well controlled and also relatively well observable because people leave these digital traces that I already talked about, and we can use these digital traces to model these online environments in a relatively realistic way. And using simulations does make us independent from the goodwill of platform companies, which is really an asset in this environment where the companies clearly do not want to change. They would allow us for testing many different scenarios and also using this kind of scenario-based risk assessment approach that I briefly sketched. However, we are of course still talking about computer simulations, so we do have challenges with how valid the things we do are, how well we can predict how these online environments will develop, and we would rely on some non-public data to do that. I'm almost at the end. The last thing I wanted to mention here is that data is an important thing, that people coming at these research questions with the approaches that I use care about a lot. Data is our fuel. We need data to train our machine learning models and to observe human behavior online. And sadly, it seems that we have entered what we call a dark age of social media data access. Almost all the major platforms have closed down their data access for researchers. I don't even think that this is largely because they don't like us finding out things about the platforms that might be uncomfortable. I think this is mostly driven by the whole development in the large language model area, where they simply don't like other companies scraping their content and training LLMs on it. And researchers are kind of caught in this whole development. So yeah, this is just a list of all the platforms that have shut down their APIs or made it very, very difficult to access their data. However, there is hope. And again, it comes in the form of the Digital Services Act that actually provides provisions for researchers to access data from platforms, public but also non-public data. Currently, they have a consultation process, or they had a consultation process until December 12th on a delegated act that would regulate how we can access the data, that non-public data. And the whole community is very much excited about this, but also a bit anxious how this will turn out and how much data protection things will be involved and how difficult it will be to actually get our hands on the data. But anyways, this is an extremely active field right now, and lots of things are happening that will shape what we can do in the next years with researching social media platforms. With this, I'm at the end. I'm also at the end of my voice. In this last bit, to briefly summarize, I've talked about the kind of divergence of the interests of social media platforms from the interests of society, and the DSA as a means to balance between these interests. What I at my lab will be concerned with in the next years to come will be the development of alternative content recommendation algorithms that try to balance the risk to civic discourse with freedom of expression and engagement. And a thing that I feel is important to mention here is that what we are talking about here is not censoring. So it's not deleting individual pieces of content or making them inaccessible. What we're talking about is a redistribution of attention through content recommendation. And that, I think, is an important lens to look through, because it sidesteps kind of this whole discussion of infringing on freedom of expression. It's still a bit of a concern, but it's less severe, because in the end, what will change is that a piece of content that might be hateful is simply not seen by 100,000 users anymore, but only seen by 1,000 users anymore. And that means that the piece of content is not deleted. The user that posted it can still have it on the internet. It simply means that it will probably be less of a risk to society as a whole by being given less attention. And this is how I would like to end. My slides are available freely online, and they will also stay online. And I'm very happy now to hear your thoughts and discuss with you.
Thank you very much for this, Jana. As I had expected, this was just breathtakingly interesting to all of us here. From everything that you said, I could give a lot of comments on this also from my perspective. But I would like to start with two questions that were mentioned in the chat, if you agree. The first one is this one. I mean, this is a rather obvious one, and it's a rather political one. What are your opinions on Meta no longer fact-checking the content, especially with the explanation that fact-checkers are somehow biased?
Yeah. What am I thinking about this? I mean, in a way, it's a continuation of the increasingly political or politicized discussion that we've seen surrounding this whole question of what is misinformation and how does it spread online. I think the argument that fact checkers are biased is bogus, given my own experience with fact checking organizations and fact checking sites. There is even research, explicit research, that recruited fact checkers with diverse political leanings and asked this crowd of diverse fact checkers to fact check the same content. And there is very high agreement on what is factual information and what is non-factual information between fact checkers from different political backgrounds. So I think the argument is bogus. I'm sad to see this development, but I'm really not surprised given the political developments in the US. I do hope that the Digital Services Act provides a barrier against this development in the EU, because as I understand it, it mandates some level of fact-checking and moderation for large online platforms in the EU. But it will be interesting to see how this develops. And I'm not super optimistic, I have to say.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Do you think he would allow machine learning software to clean, he probably meaning the DSA, allow machine learning software to clean up this information? Can the DSA force him to do so?
I mean, so when it comes specifically to information quality and machine learning, I am a bit less of a techno enthusiast, let's say. This is why I had this whole bit about journalistic practices in NewsGuard in my talk. So what machine learning does when it operates on text is that it picks up on patterns in this text to make predictions about what this is about. I've shown you how this works for counter speech, and if we would use machine learning to identify disinformation, we would follow a very similar approach. So we would use or train a machine learning algorithm on a set of labeled disinformation examples and then make it automatically predict what is disinformation. Mm-hmm. The underlying assumption here is that from the pure structure of the text, we can infer if something is factual. And I do not think that this is possible, because why should reality, like whether something is reflected in reality, leave a trace in how something is phrased? And even if it is, even if people that describe something that is factual somehow use different words or different grammatical structures to do that, it would be fairly easy to change these patterns if a dedicated malicious actor would try to fool machine learning algorithms. And we've actually seen this happening a little bit during COVID, where in the beginning it was fairly easy to identify COVID conspiracy theories and misinformation related to COVID. But over the course of the pandemic, we've seen how the conspiracy discourses related to COVID have adopted extremely scientific jargon. And this is how a machine learning algorithm would actually try to pick up on whether something is disinformation. And that's why I don't think machine learning for disinformation is a good idea. I think looking at the processes that lead to how information is created is the better and better justifiable approach to this. But I might be wrong.
There is a clarification coming. Him in the question is Zuckerberg. So the question then is whether Meta/Facebook would be inclined to use some kind of machine learning software to clean up this information. And my answer to this, if I may, Anna, would be,
Sure.
I think it's quite likely that this will be an attempt because it's much cheaper than humans. It's that simple. And they don't, I mean, I don't think that they have any incentive to do anything which is not legally the absolute requirement, right?
I agree with you here. So answering the question, yes, he's likely to do it. No, I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah. Okay, good. Wonderful. One more from that person. Would you say he's trying, so Zuckerberg probably again is trying to please Musk since he's adapting his smokescreen of freedom of speech and Musk will lead a department?
I think he's more trying to please Trump, to be honest, but it's probably at this point the same thing. And yeah, I mean, this is not science, but my personal opinion. Yes, I do think that this is the motivation. I mean, Nicholas, you already mentioned it's cheaper to use machine learning instead of people. That's probably one motivation as well. But the other, I think, is very likely to be related to the political environment. And we see the developments of the US trying to ban TikTok. And especially Trump was also pretty hostile towards Facebook in the past. So they might simply be afraid that there are some legal measures to, I don't know, reduce the reach and power of Facebook or Meta as a whole in the US. And they're trying to preempt that by being compliant.
Yeah. Next question, was there a winner between the Reconquistas and are they still active?
I don't think they're still active, or at least not in an organized way. So it might be that individuals are still active from those groups. And well, was there a winner? I mean, in a way, Reconquista Internet was successful in many instances. But then if you define winning by completely eradicating hate, of course not. But there was no winner declared in any formal way.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, so these are all the questions that I have so far from the audience. Please, if you're listening to this and you have additional questions, feel completely free, of course, to ask them now in the chat. I will take care of them. But for the meantime, let me, if I may, add some questions and some remarks. So the first and most important question to everyone who is not into the research arena as much as Jana and me are, just to make that very clear, the research Jana is talking about here in her ESC grant is the most prestigious research funding source available in Europe. So having an ESC grant is something like the Nobel Prize in our arena. So it's an outstandingly impressive performance and evaluation of this performance that we are talking about here. And I really, really, really deeply admire and appreciate that you take this and that you take the time at the same time to communicate what you're doing here so early, so relatively early. So really, really impressive. Thank you for this. And now the questions. So, I mean, I have plenty of questions, but let's start with the very last one, or the most obvious one, because you said quite clearly that you hope that you will get access to data because there is this Article 40 of the DSA and the delegated regulation coming out of this. Let me just share with everyone here now my screen. So hopefully you see this here now. So this is the provision that your hope relies on, Jana, right? So this is that very large online platforms have to provide to the coordinator, blah, 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 the information. And then there is, in the quite hidden area here, you find the researchers, right? So this is the clause. Upon a reasoned request from the coordinator, so it's not the researcher themselves, it's the coordinator, it's an authority, very large online platforms, blah, blah, within the reasonable period as specified in the request, have to provide access to data to vetted researchers who meet specific requirements. So that's an additional burden here, for the sole purpose of conducting research that contributes to the detection, identification of understanding of systemic risks in the Union. Systemic risk is the risk category that is to be applied to very large online platforms. So this is the Article 35, 34 thing that Jana was referring about before, so that they are in a way contributing to disorientation in society, let's put it like this. So this is this clause, and there will be delegated acts coming out of this Article 40. My reading of this, Jana, with all caution and all respect here, is that it will not be very simple for you and any other researcher to get anybody in Facebook or TikTok or whatever you are looking at to share data that is useful to you within a reasonable period of time. So my question now is, and that's a very open question, do you have any indication how this will work during the lifetime of your project already?
I mean, so there's two things, right? There is the public data and there is the non-public data.
Yeah.
And the public data that is also not tied to this delegated act, that we already see to start working again, actually. So specifically in the case of X, I'm most familiar with because I did most of my research on this platform. It used to be a heaven for researchers because they had what is called an application programming interface, an API, that is a automated way to request data from their platform that researchers could apply to with a fairly standardized, quick process, and then get 10 million tweets per month that we could simply download, specifying certain selection criteria and study. And then they shut this down in April last year, shortly after Musk took over, and the DSA opened that again for us. So I know researchers who have access to Twitter data again through this API. It's a bit more restricted, so we only get 1 million and not 10 million a month. But in principle, this is now open again. So that's already pretty good. And so I can do many of the things that I plan to do in my research with public data, not to the fullest extent. So the primary thing here is that by just using public data, we don't see what people see. We only see what people post and what they react to. But what we do not have access to is these feeds that people get shown. We do not get what is called exposure information. And we also do not get impression information. So how often was a piece of content seen by a user? We can approximate that by looking at reactions that is public information. But we do not get the real thing. So I think I can do the bare bones of what I propose to do with the public information, and getting access to that, I think, is very reasonable expectation. We already have a lot of archival data from the platforms that we can also build on. But getting the non-public information, the exposure information, that would be the holy grail. And I've been involved a bit in this consultation process that they had on the delegated act. I know that the coordinators did rounds with researchers to collect feedback. I've also submitted feedback to the EU. We have also seen or read the feedback that, for example, Amazon submitted, and it really looks like it's going to be a battle about the nitty-gritty. So it's going to be about data protection. The platforms are going to argue that this is extremely sensitive information, and researchers need to probably have some kind of ISO certified analysis environments, and will make it very, very hard. And we will probably need to hire people like you to write our reasonable requests.
Oh, the irony, right? That suddenly data protection is becoming so popular, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, the funniest argument I've read is that the users of the platforms did not consent to this type of research. Yeah. So therefore, the data cannot be given. But then they add all types of random clauses to their terms of use that users have to agree to, because otherwise they cannot use the platform. So why not simply add another clause that says there can be research with this data? But yeah, it will be a slow process. I mean, the EU is setting up a platform to organize this data access requests and to also organize the coordinators to make sure that there is kind of a consistent and streamlined approach to this. A lot will depend on the coordinator in Ireland because all of the platforms sit there except for Zalando. So a lot will depend on how platform friendly they are.
Very similar again to GDPR, right? Where everything
Yes.
was and still is in Ireland as well. Yeah.
Exactly. But I had the feeling that at least the Commission is pretty dedicated to like making this happen. And there is now also the European Center for Algorithmic Transparency, the ECAT in Seville. That is kind of the European, the Commission's research arm that is also accessing data and trying to conduct research, helping the Commission in their various lawsuits against the platforms. And they are also very deeply involved in this, like formulating this delegated act. So I at least see that there is interest and support, and then we will see how it plays out.
Yeah, there's a follow-up question on this coming from the audience again regarding the statement that there will be difficulties with receiving information from big companies. Are there chances of sympathetic insiders sending you the necessary data secretly, or is that something that is not done?
So I haven't seen it, not for the type of data we're talking about. Maybe for internal documents, like internal reports or something like that, there might be whistleblowers, but I don't see it happening for the millions and billions of posts that we would need to study. And the second issue is that even if this would happen, we would not be able to use it because we researchers are also bound to ethical obligations. And well, let's put it like this. Even if this happens, it will be extremely hard to make an argument why it is ethical to use this information that was obtained illegally. So I would not see that as a good way to approach the issue.
Yeah. May I just add one more question on this from my side, which is, I mean, you mentioned Cambridge Analytica somewhere in your presentation, and I think, one of the interesting aspects in my view of Cambridge Analytica is that at least many people think that it started as a kind of research project, right? So the argument to get access to the data was that was used for research. So my question to you now is how to avoid then, do you think that the provisions as they look like at the moment in the DSA and also the practical outcome of those provisions, Article 40, etc., are the right instruments to avoid that something like Cambridge Analytica can happen again? Because that's, in my view, a strong point for those platforms arguing that this is obviously something we can't want to happen once again, right? So what would you say about that?
It's a good point. I mean, the provisions are already pretty strong, right? They limit the use cases quite severely to systemic risk research.
Yeah.
They limit the scope of the data we can request, both in terms of volume as well as in terms of time, I think. They make sure that it's only vetted researchers. So that, I think, means people that work at academic institutions and are somehow accredited. So all of these steps do help in preventing another Cambridge Analytica. Whether they are sufficient to completely exclude the possibility that this happens, different question. But then again, I think it comes to an ethical argument about the danger of another Cambridge Analytica happening versus the danger of these platforms keep operating as they are and being unobservable while they do.
Yes, but sorry, Jana, I think it's an ethical argument, true, but it's also a legal argument because at the same time there are all kinds of legal requirements for those platforms to meet to avoid such situations like Cambridge Analytica happening again, right? So they need to outbalance somehow in their risk assessment also the risk that there is some kind of misuse happening with this, right? Can also be a data security issue, by the way, which is another argument they constantly use then, right? So it's also legal. It's not just ethical.
Yes, and I do
Yeah.
think so. Returning to or coming to legal, where I'm not as well versed, but I do
Yeah.
think that the technical and organizational measures that they list in this delegated act will be sufficient to reduce the risk for another Cambridge Analytica to happen to an acceptable level.
Okay, so your assessment of the regulatory environment, as much as you see it at the moment, is positive. Therefore, you think that it's fit for purpose.
I do think so. Yes, in the grand scheme of things, yes, I do think it's a pretty good approach.
Okay. So then let's go then, if I may, again, because that was another detail that I found very interesting, and I think it's the core of parts of what you are doing here. So this is Article 35, which is about the mitigation of risk, which is an obligation for very large online platforms. So again, just to everyone here who is not very much into this is specifically dealing with platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Reddit, etc. So you need to have a certain size to meet this. And then your argument is that these mitigation of risk need to find or need to meet a lot of requirements, including that they need to adapt. So those very large online platforms need to test and adapt their algorithmic systems, including their recommender systems, in order to mitigate the systematic risks that are further described in Article 33 and 34. The problem that I have with this, and that's also the question, is again that when you look into this long list of obligations for these very large online platforms, how they should mitigate the risks, and when you look into how platforms normally so far have dealt with such requirements, the outcome of this could also be a rather lengthy report on what they are doing or not doing, and not necessarily a change of their algorithmic systems in the way that you would expect them or hope or suggest to them that they should use. And my question again to you is whether you see this argument that I'm making here, or this risk that I'm describing here. And again, if so, whether you think that the regulation as it stands here is fit to mitigate that regulatory risk properly.
I don't know how qualified I am to assess the regulation and how fit for purpose it is, because that would require me to assess also how well it can be executed, right? And if it's sufficient to just produce a report, if you ever have to try this in front of a court. What I think, and this might take decades of work, this is now an obligation for the community to produce evidence that shows that specific measures that are listed there are more fit for the purpose than others. And I'm personally convinced that the recommender systems are a very important part to that, because they are so central to the functioning of these platforms. But I think we are a very long way from establishing a causal relationship between a recommender working in a certain way and an election in Romania turning sour. So there is, of course, a lot of circumstantial evidence and anecdotes, but to really make this chain of arguments and evidence, we are a long way from that. This is where I want to contribute, but it could turn into big oil or big tobacco, and it will need decades to accumulate all of this knowledge to actually then make a case that allows the regulator to actually enforce changes.
Yeah.
But what do you think? I mean, you're the expert on the regulation.
I mean, I could answer very diplomatically now, which is very much like you answered. Actually, I want to use that argument, which is I don't know, because it will take years until this is finally decided by a court, and that at the same time, this is very true, but it's also a very problematic answer in the sense of that it's not very unlikely that this is going to happen to last 5 to 10 years until the very first decisions are taken here. And the history of GDPR has shown that 5 or 10 years are on the internet are 30 or 50 years in real life. So everything is completely different then from when you start this debate. And platforms are interesting also in the sense of that they have unlimited resources for legal debates and legal cases to fight through, right? So it's a very or relatively simple thing to write something like this into a code, but it's much more difficult than to enforce this in a way that changes the environment in time.
Yeah. I mean, so something that is interesting to me that I learned while I was doing background research also for my grant application is that this is the first time that this kind of risk-based approach to regulation is applied to online systems. I have learned that it originated from the banking sector after the financial crisis, but it's very unclear how this will play out for online systems. I mean, now the AI Act does a very similar thing, right? They provide these risk categories. I mean, it has the nice or the upside that these risks are pretty immutable. They will not change even if the technical systems that operate change a lot in the next 10 years. What is a risk, or like democratic processes and civic discourse or human rights are much more long-lived than technical systems. So at least the regulation will persist in that way, or will still remain up to date in that it addresses things that are long-lived. But then the other side of that is, of course, that they're so fuzzy, right? I mean, there's how do you pin down a risk to human dignity? But there's precedent, right? There is human dignity courses that have been tried, and we will need to learn that for online platforms.
True, but at the same time, again, leading back to one of the questions that one of the people in the audience asked or made a remark on, is the problem now is what we see literally in these days is a complete backlash in the home country of all those platforms, right? So you said that you hope that Europe will stand its case here, but when you listen to what Zuckerberg is saying, and when you follow the US debate a little bit, you can find quite some counterpositions, that put it like this, right? Some counterpositions that might also be useful for those companies outside Europe. And I don't know whether Europe is that critical then at the end, right? So, or the European perspective is that important, or that convincing here.
Yeah. And then also if it intersects with political realities, right? So I think that was largely missed by the discussion. But last summer, I think Trump tweeted or posted something on Truth Social where he said he will tie the US's participation in NATO to, the Digital Services Act and that not being enforced.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, and that, I mean, when it comes to that, then I don't see the political reality coming out in favor of the DSA, to be honest. But I mean, the kind of nice and diplomatic answer from the researcher in me to argue why my research is still important. This can, of course, also lead to the development of alternative platforms, right? If we know how recommenders connect to societal developments, we can use that knowledge to develop platforms that are better. And then there is also a long-term competition argument to be made here. So we do see that platforms that optimize for engagement are short-time very successful because they draw in users, and then there's network effects that keep these users. But what we see happening on Twitter now is that if you overdo it and it becomes a hateful only place, then the users that create the high quality content leave the platform in the long run. they go somewhere else. Now they go to Blue Sky. I mean, the jury is still out whether this will be the next big thing or whether we will just see a fragmentation into very different social media ecospheres. But this could be a long-term perspective that this is all leading to a development of a healthier ecosystem of different platforms.
Yeah. Let me just make one remark and then one question. The remark is, I am completely convinced, and this is the very reason why I'm inviting you, Jana, that your research is of utmost importance. So of course this is important, and I by no means wanted to say anything about that this is not important. The contrary. My remark was just about the impact of the regulatory environment on what those platforms are going to do, right? Just to clarify this. Now, the remark on your Twitter/X case, and then a question on this. I see very much like you that people leave Twitter/X and go to Blue Sky. And Twitter, for me personally, has become completely unusable and uninteresting. So whenever I come there, I leave from very egoistic reasons after 30 seconds, because the only things that I see is Musk/Trump/whoever making an argument that Greenland should become part of the American territory, something like this at the moment. However, this has become, in my view at least, a complete political propaganda instrument, obviously leading into one direction with billion, or I don't know how many billions of users. Not that important, therefore, whether me personally finding this an interesting platform or not any longer, right? So I think the Trump X case shows also that the typical thoughts of typical European regulators on what people expect when running a platform or when visiting a platform might not necessarily be true for X. And the strategic interests of Trump might not necessarily have been those that the Digital Services Act wants to target, right? If you're not really interested, if you're not interested in the business outcome of your platform, because you use this as a propaganda instrument like in 1933, you will not be hit by something using economical rationalist arguments. The question now for me on this is, how could this be assessed by research that people like you are doing? I mean, the first part of your presentation today was dealing with data that was 5 years old or so, right? So relatively outdated already, and for very good reasons outdated, because it's quite some work to do the work that you are doing on this. Whereas on the other hand, when you look into this X/Blue Sky thing, this is a matter of days or weeks sometimes, and it's a very political and emotional and whatsoever process that people go through when they are deciding to do this. So how can one try to get a picture on this or even influence this via research and or regulatory attempts coming out of the research people like you are doing? I don't know whether this is an understandable question, and I don't know whether you want to answer it if it is understandable.
I can give it a shot. I mean, at least the research perspective, it's becoming harder, but it's still doable. So, I mean, the platforms try to prevent us from getting their data, but in the end, everything that we can see on the internet, we can download. We can find ways. It's an arms race. The platforms try to prevent us. We build different, better scrapers. The nice thing about the Digital Services Act is that it says that public information should be accessible to researchers. And we also call this the scraping paragraph, because we interpret it as giving us permission to break the terms of service to get this public data for research purposes. And I mean, this is how we could at least monitor what is happening. Still possible. And then calling out what is happening by showing, for example, how hateful Twitter has become, how many bots are active there, how much of it is LLM-generated slop, to what extent that interfaces with the regulatory environment, I'm less sure, because as you mentioned, regulation is slow. And what happens on social media is extremely fast. It's even too fast for the classic research approaches where we have, we write publications and we have peer review, and this all takes a year until it's published somewhere. So this is really more a case of what I would call crisis research. So what we did during COVID, where we did studies in days, and then we had internal peer reviews and we published them as preprints. I see my field, computational social science, or at least parts of it, going very strongly in this direction, where we simply provide mostly descriptive insights into what is happening right now that might also be less valuable to elucidate fundamental facts about human behavior online, because they're more geared towards showing what is happening right now, but still could be extremely useful in the global or societal argument that is happening about these platforms.
Were you ever contacted by any of those platforms with what you're doing? I mean, did any of them ever show any interest on this?
No. I was contacted by the commission.
Okay.
Not by the platform.
Fair enough. Yeah. Fair enough. Okay, Jana, we have been talking now for more than 2 hours, and I don't want to consume you even more, but let me just ask one last question that is, in my view, very important, in particular to the younger people in the audience, which is, if one wants to join what you are doing or participate in some of the work that you are and other people like you are doing, what should people do? What can people do to get some grip on this?
I mean, write a master thesis, write a grant, write me a message and ask for collaboration. Think about this and do your own research project. It's very hard to answer so broadly, because I assume most of the audience is lawyers, and I'm very much not familiar.
This is why I'm asking. So is there any use of young lawyers in this debate? And if so, how could they contribute?
Well, I mean, I have mentioned this, and it was only half a joke. People writing reasonable requests for data access for us. I've seen this. I tried to write something giving feedback on the current draft of the Delegated Act, and it was very hard for me because I don't speak legalese. And then I've seen the statement by Amazon, which was 30 pages, structured in paragraphs and definitions and whatnot. And I was like, oh my God, we're up against this. How will we be able to compete? And this is, I think, why you would come in very, very handy. And then also translating this whole technical stuff that we do into where it connects to the regulation. And also telling us researchers, like, this is where we think evidence could help. This is where there is a specific hook in the existing language. And if we could provide evidence in that way, or look into the specific context, this could really help drive forward a specific case, or I don't know, a specific piece of regulation that is being developed. There's so much translation work, and people that are generally interested in this and don't shy away from talking to technical experts, and have a firm grip on the legal side of things, in my opinion, extremely valuable.
Okay, so if you hear this and you are interested and you do have some legal background, feel free to bring yourself into this game. I want to share with you that I think it is a very fruitful and very, very useful initiative that will help, and also you personally, in developing your research interests and your career. Jana, thank you so much. For me, this was really a highlight of the whole week. I appreciated this a lot. I want to congratulate you once again, both to your research and to your ability to explain your research in a language that is understandable to non-technical people. Thank you so much for this in the name of all my students and in my own name. I really, really like this a lot. Thank you. My students now, please switch over to Zoom. We are going to use the usual platform now for the rest of today's lecture. For now, I close this session with a very, very warm thank you to everyone. Stay healthy, stay in contact with us, and stay active in the domain. Thank you.
Thank you too.